Welcome to episode number 253, Mirrors. If I asked you what you saw when you look in the mirror, what would you tell me? Actually, that particular question isn't necessarily easy to answer, as much as it might seem to be. The things we most often see in the physical mirror are our flaws and weaknesses. We see a hair out of place, a stain on our clothing, birthmarks, and everything in detail. We also see our spiritual weaknesses. Not only do we see those in detail, but we feel them in detail. We know where we are frail, and we deeply feel those particular weaknesses. We feel them so deep and so poignantly that for us they are as obvious as the zit on the end of our nose. We see our weaknesses as glaring and obvious, but the truth is that most of our weaknesses are not obvious to anyone but ourselves. Yes, the world will find something by which to torment us, but our true weaknesses are often hid so deeply that no one would even guess that we had such a problem in our lives. This is often the case with our mental and emotional illness. We hide and mask the symptoms so skillfully that no one would guess we had such a terrible emotional turmoil going on inside of us. We look calm, cool, and collected on the outside, but on the inside, it is as if we have entered the very torture chambers of hell. However, what we don't see or recognize on a real level is that our emotions can only be seen through our physical mannerisms. And for the most part, because we all mask our emotions to some extent, we really don't know what people are thinking or feeling. Now, masking is the ability to conceal one's true feelings and intentions by showing false mannerisms and facial expressions that more closely match someone who is at peace or happy. Although we do not attempt to guess another's emotions and intent regularly. Our emotions are such a part of who we are that our mind and body believe that everyone can easily see those emotions and our struggles. However, the statement is untrue. That particular statement is untrue for at least 3 reasons. 1, a person judging your intent and emotional state really cannot do anything but guess. Related to that particular guessing, we tend to be wrong most of the time. 2, most people are concerned with their own weaknesses and glaring emotional problems that they don't have time to focus on our problems. We all tend to be very egocentric, meaning the world revolves around us. And that probably makes sense because in some ways we create that world that we live in. So in a way, the world does kind of revolve around us and our creation of reality in our brain. 3, we can only feel what we have experienced. Someone who has never experienced depression can only understand it in the sense of perhaps the death of a close friend or loved one. But even then, that isn't true depression, where the troubling feelings come without rhyme or reason. The reality is that no one can see your emotions or your weaknesses because they have weaknesses of their own that they are also trying to hide. However, something important to think about. Because we have experienced something, our mind tends to believe that everybody has experienced the same thing. Again, this has to do with our egocentric mind. For some reason, our mind has trouble comprehending that another person may not understand at all what we feel. Our mind even struggles at times to comprehend that someone we know and love doesn't fully comprehend our mental and emotional difficulties. Our mind would like to think that everyone experiences life as we do, and in some ways it projects our reality in that sense onto others. Because we don't know how everyone is feeling, and because we can't really know, our mind just simply fills in the informational gap and assumes that they do understand. This creates a serious problem, an issue when we are struggling to find our footing. If the mind believes that everyone understands our trials and struggles emotionally, then it will be looking for comments and comfort in regard to that illness from others. We tend to look for validation of our ideas from other people. Validation is simply another person recognizing our current state of emotions and difficulties. It is them recognizing our identity and who we really are. We are always looking for validation from this world. That is part of who we are as human beings and our insatiable need to fit in. We need feedback from the masses to know if we are falling into the culture and social norms of the day. We also need feedback to understand what another person is feeling and thinking. We desperately need feedback spiritually from our Father in heaven. The reality is that the only feedback that provides any real significant value is that of the Savior and the Father. Most of the feedback, in fact, almost all of the feedback we receive from the world will be communicated poorly, exaggerated immensely, focused on the wrong areas of our lives, shallow in detail and depth, and completely useless. Although we still tend to use that feedback we get, even when we know that it isn't correct. If I wear the most awful, conflicting, contrasting shirt to church, I am sure to get some feedback. Now, most of that feedback will be attempting to keep me in line with the culture of white shirts. Nothing wrong with that culture. It's actually quite valuable to have such things as standards of dress. But the sentiment is the same no matter what I do. Most feedback is not constructive and is meant simply to keep me in line with the culture. However, the feedback that the Savior provides is always uplifting and beneficial to the soul. Even when the Lord is direct and honest with me about my actions, I don't feel condemned. Rather, I feel emboldened to take on the challenge and to win the day. The Savior's feedback provides a stable foundation upon which one can build that will not drift away with the next storm like the shifting sands of our society. Most often, the world is focused on our exterior physical attributes, temporary attributes that change with time. The Savior most often focuses on intent and core spiritual emotions and experiences, and correcting our problems at the source rather than just trying to correct our behavior. When we hear the word speak, when we hear the world speak, and they are loud, we're very likely to take the actions and intents of another and twist them to our own reality, and then we interpret them incorrectly. We as humans are terrible at filling in informational blanks because we can only fill it in with our own experience. We are limited by what we personally know, and ultimately that's very limited, even if you were the most intelligent person on the planet. So let's talk about an example for this to make sense. Let's say I am struggling one day at church with my anxiety/depression problems. For me, as for most people, depression makes me somewhat non-communicative. And the anxiety causes issues with approaching individuals to communicate. So because of my emotions, I can look sullen, intimidating, and sometimes unfriendly rather than welcoming. I can look unapproachable and as though I am not interested in conversation or even you as an individual. Now, yes, the depression does make me feel that way, but individuals are not seeing my depression when they see my face. They see an older man with no smile on his face and his head down. Not really anybody that's approachable. What they might see is someone who's cranky or elitist, unfriendly, uncaring, and yet the reality is none of those things. He's simply suffering with the effects of depression. No one would guess that unless they had experienced depression, and then they might still get it wrong. So often when we suffer, those around us make poor assumptions about our mental and emotional health. Let's take another example. A beautiful young woman, educated and spiritual, has trouble building and keeping relationships. She desperately wants to get married, but her anxiety just causes issues with communications and relationships. With her friends, she doesn't have any issues, but with someone who might be a possible date, she fumbles and struggles even to get out a few sentences. And then after, she analyzes those statements over and over again, knowing that she has just destroyed any chance she ever had. When the young man doesn't speak to her for whatever reason, she will use that moment to confirm those feelings. Why didn't the young man, possibly suitor, speak to her? It could have been actually for a number of reasons, giving a young man. However, when we are anxious, we have strong tendencies to demonstrate reserved shyness, and that causes us to appear uninterested. We are trying so hard to conceal our anxiety and fears that we simply come across as uninterested or even worse, elitist. What we see so glaringly in each of these examples is the significant difference between perceptions of the individuals. While the young woman is trying desperately to hide her anxiety, it is not perceived this way. The perception is quite different for the one attempting to understand the facial expressions and visual cues of the depressed person. We can and often do read people incorrectly, and we judge them through what little experience we have in this life. And often, almost every time, those judgments we make about someone are wrong or false or inaccurate. But we make them because our brain needs them. Without understanding anything about the other person, the brain must concoct a story to make sense of what it's seeing externally. This person takes my expressions and then matches it up to somebody from their past. And then they will assign the characteristics of the person they knew in the past and then project them back upon me. Now, these people were rude and standoffish to me on a regular basis that looked just like him. I don't like elitists. Why doesn't he smile? What's his issue? You see, we walk into a situation already having formed opinions based on what we had previously experienced in our lives. It gives us a base to work from, to establish the real story. But often we don't search for a real story. We too often use the concocted story as what is true. The same is true for the person who suffers from mental and emotional health conditions. They are going to create a story similar in a similar way, taking limited information about you and creating answers as to why you are behaving the way you do. Goodness, that person's strange. Why do they stare like that? What is their issue? Do I really look that strange? Is something wrong with my clothing, my shoes, my hair? I think that we can each regularly admit to our brain filling in large gaps of information without knowing whether that information is true. Science calls this a bias because we always fill in the blanks from our own experiences, and thus we taint the information with our own personalized color. It's like taking a coloring picture and matching the colors of the person next to you without even looking at what colors they are using. Now, we might know the basic colors, but we will never be able to fully match the other coloring page. The statistics are just astronomical. Now, why go through all of that discussion? Because it really directly impacts our mental health. When we fill in the blanks during an episode of depression, anxiety, or bipolar in our minds, we are tainting that information with a significant bias or depressing, anxiety, bipolar emotion. We can't see good in ourselves, and so we struggle to see good in others. Actions and intentions. We can't feel happiness, so we assume it in others. We can't feel the spirit in our lives regularly, and so we transfer all of this to others to a limited extent. Something our minds do that is strange when it creates biased information. It only creates a certain level of detail. We tend to whitewash the other person and the scene, ignoring the large looming fact that we live in the same world and are subject to the same problems, difficulties, and sins. So not only do we fill in the blank character traits of another person, almost immediately upon meeting them, we do so without detail and without the struggle that allowed them to rise and obtain those characteristics. In other words, we don't know their backstory. It's like calling for Batman without knowing anything about him. The name is strange unless you understand his history. Without that history, a guy running around in a black bat suit with strange toys is going to seem very strange and weird to us all. Unless you know the story, you wouldn't even be able to understand why he does what he does. So you whitewash his story, leaving out the struggle and only showing that he is some type of a vigilante. Finally, we tend to cast our image upon the other person in the conversation and then use the expression they give to us as clues as to intent and emotional concerns. We see other people through a comparison to ourselves. We really can't help it. That is encoded deeply within our DNA. So when we see another person, and that person looks stern for a moment, without even knowing that they are casting such an expression, we will evaluate them based on how we feel when we look like that. So that stern moment, which might have been simply a struggle in a moment of prayer, has now been fully calculated before any real information is obtained. And we do this all the time, and every human being does it. However, knowing the way others go about making decisions and judgments can help you tremendously. If you see an older man with a scowl on his face, he may not be that intimidating, just struggling emotionally. When you see that young man or woman hesitant to engage, they might not be truly shy, but rather have a serious anxiety that could be allayed if someone with a comfortable voice and a friendly manner includes them. So now you ask, Brother Soka, have you even tried this? Does it work? Can you really avoid your personal bias? And the answer is no, not entirely. Your mind's always going to fill in the blanks and assign information to another person. It can't work any differently because that's the structure of the mind. It only has one good processor, and it needs shortcuts to make our life livable. But we can, in almost every instance, avoid quickly assigning character traits and information bias to someone, and simply ask a few questions about them. No, this may not necessarily be possible when you have little desire to communicate, such as in a depression. Now, A word of caution about this masking that we do as human beings. Every person in this world begins to mask their true emotions early in life. Now, we tend to refer to it as controlling our emotions, and we should probably be thinking about ways to properly express emotions, but we teach our children to repress their emotions. And that is perhaps a story for another day. Masking is the way most all individuals control their emotions. We live with the emotion inside of us, but we mask it into what is needed for our social setting. Those who suffer from mental and emotional illness also mask, but they become far more expert at it. This is simply because they get far more practice. And masking is certainly an important part of blending into social circles without causing issues. However, it comes with a few downsides and a terrible cost. The first of these you might actually not recognize. When you mask, it takes a great deal of emotional energy to maintain the mask. You will find yourselves exhausted without reason and exhausted all the time. The more time you spend in the mask state, the worse it's going to get. The second issue with masking is that it does not bring any form of happiness or joy. It cannot bring joy because it is a lie from the very foundation. You can't lie yourself into happiness or joy. Joy comes from the most pure form of action, when we are obedient to the commands of God for the right reasons. I have seen many people attempt to mask their way to happiness, blending in, taking on them entirely unique and falsified personalities in public. These people are some of the most miserable people I know. They desire happiness, but they cannot have it because they are looking truly in all the wrong places. You can't fake true happiness by altering your facial expressions. And yet, strangely, so many of us try. When masking doesn't work, individuals often go on a life journey to discover themselves. What they are doing really, and most often, is truing their inner life, their inner spiritual life, with their outer life. They are living a more honest life with themselves and with God. Masking takes a terrible toll on our relationship with the Savior. However, you can't wear your emotions on your sleeve all the time as well. So neither masking nor living without masks is very helpful to build genuine relationships. So we must create a balance. Hopefully a balance in which the scale is weighted heavy to the one's true personality and spiritual nature, and we limit the masking we need to do. As you leave masking behind and limit its scale in your life, you are going to find much greater happiness, specifically and generally. However, to leave masks behind is not easy. To leave masking behind, we are showing our true selves, and that frightens most of us to death. Because if someone doesn't like our true selves, we generally cannot change it very easily. If someone doesn't like the way we mask, that's actually easy to change. However, masking will always end up in spiritual death. We must confront who we are with the Lord. The Lord looks right through our mask and sees us as we truly are. He wants to change us. Not just the mask, but that requires being honest with ourselves and others as we seek that change of heart. When we look in any mirror, there is no value in looking in that mirror by yourself. You should always be there with the Savior. And you should know the Savior's voice because it's stated that specifically in Doctrine and Covenants 1:21-41, His voice will always be persuasive, long-suffering, gentle, meek, loving, kind, merciful, and most of all, enlarging to the soul. If the voice comes in any other way, then it's not the Savior. My personal hope is that you will find greater peace in working with the Savior on what you see in the mirror rather than what the world sees. If you are feeling condemned, guilty, unpardoned, burdensome, emotional, then it is not of the Lord. He is there to lift, not to cut you down. When we look in the mirror, we should always see ourselves as the Lord does, not as we do or the world does. When we do this regularly, we will find a much greater sense of happiness and peace in our lives and a much firmer foundation. Until next week, do your part so that the Lord can do His.